All right, guys, let's take a couple minutes for everybody to join in, and we will start in a couple minutes. Let's give it one more minute, and we will start at 2:02. And I'm sure it's going to be a very awesome and exciting event. Hopefully not too many people having troubles with the Teams webinar. This is our first one of those. But so far, I kind of like the technology and features that it offers.
So far, so good.
Let's keep the fingers crossed. All right, guys. Would like to welcome everyone to our first of this kind, mapping with the path to connectivity webinars. My name is Alex Frelichman. I'm with Lightlinks. Lightlinks is a manufacturer, the manufacturer of fiber optic cables and accessories. And would like to welcome Brian Rothborn, friend of mine, with Broadband Catalyst, who created really cool piece of software that is becoming extremely useful in today's world, where everybody's applying for various grants and subsidies. So on that note, I'm mostly going to be quiet. This event going to be breaking in with questions and so on. Now, a couple household items. We are recording this event, this webinar. It will be available afterwards. All mics are muted. If you have questions, when you have questions, please, they're highly encouraged. Please send them through the chat, either chat or Q&A. Both options are available for the attendees. And what else interesting? That's about it. So, Brian, please take it from here.
Thank you, Alex. I appreciate it. And hello, everybody. My name is Brian Rathbone. I've been a broadband planner for the past 15 years, and I've been fighting this battle for about 22 years. Just a quick bit of background. In 2002, I got the opportunity to work from home full time, and I bought a home in Rutherford County, North Carolina, in a rural area going out into the mountains. And my real estate agent assured me that this location had 3 different types of broadband access. And it wasn't until after I purchased the home that I learned that the DSL deployment was full. I sat on a waiting list for 15 years, and the cable deployment stopped about a quarter of a mile up the road. And it was a $35,000 build to get down to where I live. And the wireless deployment in the county was blocked by trees on my neighbor's property, so I couldn't even take a chainsaw to them, although I was tempted. But that really opened my eyes to how big of a problem that we had in rural America. And I've since learned about the underserved areas in urban parts of America. And so that's what really drove my interest in this. I spent a lot of my career writing software and building parts of the internet. So when I got the opportunity to join a nonprofit wireless provider in the county and help them raise some money, it was during that effort that I was made aware of a position at the North Carolina State Broadband Initiative. And I ended up taking that job and working in Western North Carolina as a technical assistance director, providing assistance to 31 counties in establishing or enhancing their broadband planning teams. And that was really when I started understanding the need for broadband mapping. And I ended up working at the state level, creating a North Carolina open source broadband map. And back in 2014, we went back to the private sector, at which point created a national broadband map. And we were asked to do some work for the Appalachian Regional Commission. We mapped 13 states in that. And it was really that work that caused us to form Broadband Catalysts. Myself, my colleague Deb Watts, and our colleague Jane Patterson co-founded Broadband Catalyst, and we're dedicated to improving access to broadband devices and digital skills with a focus on rural and underserved urban areas. And one of the first things that we did was map the broadband for Appalachia. And doing that, it became clear that we could scale that up to map the entire United States. And we did that, and we also added data for Canada. Since then, we've worked in a number of areas. Like I said, we did nationwide mapping for the United States and Canada, but we've got about 55 counties, boroughs, and cities that we've worked with across the country since. And we're really pleased to be working on these things nationwide, and as well as focusing on things where we live in North Carolina. So BroadbandAnalyzer is a spatial analytics platform focused on broadband mapping and digital inclusion. And the difference between BroadbandAnalyzer and the maps that even I produced in the past is that the maps that we had traditionally, you could look up one address and maybe see if that location was indicated as served and maybe learn who the providers were there. But it wasn't really very good at answering questions about how many unserved households were there, what's the housing density or the structured density in the area, and what might the estimated cost be to deploy fiber or cable or wireless into those markets. So BroadbandAnalyzer was intended to do more analytics on that data and also solve the problem of the data being siloed. A lot of times when I was working on planning, I'd have to go to one map to see where the unserved locations were. I'd have to go to another map to look at broadband funding. Actually, it was several maps at the time, but we've recently had some new maps done at the federal level. But still, it's funding in one map, availability in another, speed tests in another, and bringing them all together and analyzing them against each other has just been really challenging in the past. So our team has been working really hard, especially since the FCC, NTIA, and CostQuest released the broadband data collection from the FCC and the Fabric address level data. And so we're working, making it so that we can cross-reference these data sets in a solution. And so we've got multiple state, federal, and local data sources, most of which are at a granularity of either the census tract, census block, or the H3 hexagons, which are the newest granularity level. We hadn't really had that in the past, but the FCC's public broadband availability data is in H3 hexagon format, and it's at a specific resolution where the hexagons are roughly a half a mile wide. So in the two maps that you see in this slide, the one that's at the top shows all of the hexagons that are unserved with 25 megabits down, 3 megabits up service, which is the top priority for the funding that's coming right down, whether it's BEAD, USDA Reconnect or another funding source. At the time that those funding sources were developed, the national definition of broadband was 25 down, 3 up. And it's since been upped to 100 down, 20 up, but the eligibility requirement for these programs remains at 25.3. So anything you see in red there's at least some locations in those hexagons unserved with 25.3. And the darker the red is in these particular maps, the larger percentage of the locations in those hexagons. So where they're fairly light, there's only a few locations. And where they're really dark, almost the entire hexagon is unserved. And as you can see, we've brought into these maps the FCC funding and the federal funding, in this case, RDOF from the FCC. And the gray areas are actually state funding. This is a county in North Carolina. This is actually Cherokee County. I see I've mislabeled my slide. But this is a county in North Carolina. And we've got the gray areas were previously funded through North Carolina's Great Grant Program. And the bottom map that you see here is where we've actually filtered down to just the high cost areas. And then we selected this northwestern quadrant to just focus some numbers on that specific area. And I'll go into more on that. The way that we identify these high cost areas is either by broadband serviceable locations. That's our new term. We used to look at households, but now broadband serviceable locations can include households, businesses, government facilities, might even include a cell tower in some cases. So we look at how many broadband serviceable locations there are for every mile of roadway in each hexagon. And we can also measure it as to how many BSLs there are per square mile. The mile of roadway is usually used to measure the business case for fiber and cable providers, and then square miles is often used by wireless providers. We have the ability to filter them out by those, and by default, we set our high cost locations to be those with fewer than 3 households per linear road mile. That's where the cost per location usually starts to exceed $25,000 per location. We've seen it go as high as $1 million, but in general, in those high cost areas, it's somewhere between $25,000 and $75,000 per location in a lot of the areas that we've worked in. So this is another map. This one's in McDowell County, North Carolina. And again, we're showing the RDOF funding, the state level funding. This one also has the community anchor institutions turned on. We have government institutions, educational institutions. We also include the cell tower data from the FCC's antenna structure registration database. So what you see here for each of these locations, like for example, I've got pulled up the North Cove Volunteer Fire Department. We like to know what community anchor institutions are near the unserved areas. They can often act as infrastructure. We might, put a tower or fiber to that volunteer fire department, especially if they do telemedicine. With some of the funding coming down, hooking up these community anchor institutions to gigabit symmetrical is one of the goals of the funding, especially if there's, telemedicine involved. So this just gives you. Yes.
Sorry for the interruption. My usual style. So this is pretty interesting. I have several questions myself, but Catherine is asking, does NTIA publish a hexagon layer corresponding to the hex codes of the BSL fabric?
So NTIA in particular doesn't actually release the broadband availability data. That's actually done by the FCC, and it has a hexagon ID in every record. So when you download the public data, and I usually download the state data by technology type, and we merge that all together in our database. So every record for each location ID will tell us which provider provides which service at which type of technology and at what speeds. and it gives us the H3 resolution 8 ID, which that's what we're looking at here. So it's my understanding that Uber created the H3 library for these hexagons. So I used a Uber library from JavaScript. Actually, I might have used the Python one with QGIS to generate the hexagon layer for the country. And if I select one of these hexagons and get its ID, it's going to match with what the states use and what the federal agencies use. So the answer to that question is not directly from NTIA, but they are definitely involved.
How many layers of data are you overlapping in your analysis?
We're getting to the point that we have dozens. And one of the things that we've really been focused on a lot recently is identifying healthcare institutions in relation to these populations. So we've brought in data, we have this community anchor institution data, which includes where the hospitals are, where the pharmacies are. We want to get to the point that we have the urgent cares. We've recently brought in data from the HSRA, which has a data set called the Healthcare Practitioner Shortage Areas, which lets us determine how many people there are per dentist, how many people there are for mental health care or primary care. So we're really bringing in lots of additional data. We just added HUD-supported public housing. It's one of our priorities, is making sure that public housing is included in these deployments, because we need to give folks an on-ramp to the digital economy, and those tend to represent structures that have been historically maybe left out of commercial deployments. So I don't have the exact number, but it grows every day.
All right, I'm going back to mute Mike so I wouldn't be interrupting your train of thoughts.
Oh no, that's perfectly fine. I appreciate
guys,
the questions.
As a group, please don't be shy. Keep sending your questions as they come up.
Fantastic, thank you. So another thing that we can do is show provider footprints. In this particular case, we're looking at Madison County, North Carolina, showing the coverage footprint of French Broad Electric Membership Corporation. And the color here is how much of that hexagon has broadband service. So the lighter color hexagons are not as well served. The darker colored hexagons are pretty comprehensively served. And then the red hexagons show the unserved areas as they relate to this coverage footprint. So as we go through, and I'll show you it a little bit when we pull up one of the GIS maps, we'll pull a provider footprint for all of the providers in the region, so that we understand who's providing residential service, who's providing residential and business, and sometimes just the business service, which can be used as middle mile connectivity for new providers who want to enter the market. Quite often, those provider footprints allow us to know who's near an area that we should talk with that's already serving the area, and who might have fiber infrastructure there if they're not willing to go into these unserved areas, that they may be able to provide the middle mile infrastructure. Another thing that we look at is speed test data. This particular map of Graham County, North Carolina, shows both the UCLA data and the North Carolina speed test data. North Carolina has a survey where they're collecting that data. And the way that I've color coded this is that anything in green met the definition of broadband. It had at least 25 megabits down, 3 megabits up, and was less than 100 milliseconds of latency. Anything you see in red really met the definition of unserved. It didn't have 25 down, 3 up, or the latency was higher than 100 milliseconds. And
so as long as one of the criteria does not match, you put it into red, basically.
That's correct. That's correct. So let's just say if you were using a satellite provider and you got 100 down and 30 up, but your latency was 300 milliseconds, I'm going to flag that as red. And essentially that won't qualify as served as far as the rules are for most of these federal dollars, they require that latency to be under 100 milliseconds, which is why most of the current satellite technologies are not included as counting a location as served. And then the orange buckets are those that are somewhere between 25.3 and 120, but they don't have better than 100 down, 20 up at 100 milliseconds. So they're considered underserved, which is the second priority for these federal dollars. You know, if you don't have 25.3, you're the first priority. If you don't have 100 by 20, you're the second priority. If you have 100 by 100, low latency under than 100 milliseconds, you're considered to be served with future-proofed technology. And then these points you see, we get a little bit more granular data from North Carolina's survey, but it's color-coded the same. And so, you know, we had 813 responses in Graham County, and of those, only 3 met the download requirement for broadband. So it's very telling, and it also can be used at this point to start a challenge process. If the location that you're looking at is shown as served, with anything north of 25.3 low latency, but you're not getting that, there's a process we can go through to challenge that broadband availability data by taking a series of speed tests over time. The speed test can fluctuate depending on traffic, so there's a requirement that you do, I think it's 3 speed tests over a week. I'd have to go back and verify those exact details, but something along those lines. And that will allow that location to be flipped from served to either unserved or underserved, depending on the results of those speed tests. So at this point, this is one way to get more money to be allocated to a community that is getting less than what is advertised. So I also wanted to mention that we have the ability to also do census block level analysis. And one of the advantages of the hexagons is that in rural areas, like here in Transylvania County, North Carolina, you can see some of these census blocks are very large. And the hexagons will be smaller than those large census blocks out in the rural areas. But when you look in the urban areas, the census blocks get very small. And so sometimes when we're looking in an urban area, or even just a downtown or a county seat, we'll flip over and look at the census block data because it gives us more granularity. There is a little bit of a data skew in the census blocks in that most of the data reported these days is those broadband serviceable locations, which includes households, businesses, anchor institutions. The census block data only includes households. So this isn't quite as accurate when we look at the unserved numbers, but it's really good for highlighting areas of concern, highlighting areas we might want to survey, especially when we're looking at low-income housing and multi-dwelling units. This data is really good at highlighting areas where the coverage might be overstated. And the reason I say that is in the new BDC data, if a location is an apartment building or even a multi-tenant environment like a strip mall, it'll only be listed as one location. But we know there's a number of units. So if there's a 50-unit apartment building, it's only listed as one BSL. When we look at the census data, it will give us a better indication of how many households are listed in that area. And so by default, the FCC and others are kind of reporting these MDUs. As long as a certain percentage of the units are indicated as served, they'll show the entire MDU as served. We kind of do the opposite so we can set the goalposts and say, okay, we're not going to assume all those units are served. If we see that it's got at least one unit, we'll list it as one. And so these red areas might actually be more served as what we're showing here. But again, it shows us areas of concern and helps us geographically locate where it might be best to go and do some outreach.
Brian, so here's my question in return regarding multi-dwelling units. So what happens if, let's say, a fixed wireless access products by one of the carriers are in the area, and these guys are sitting on one of the 5G, for example, towers. How is that going back into this data, or is it being considered?
It's really, from my perspective, it's kind of hard to get to the right answer. So by default, that apartment building with 50 units is going to be listed as one BSL. And if we can serve one of those units in the FCC data, it's going to be shown as served. In our report on the census block, we're going to show it probably partially served. But if you can get access to your fabric data, which is the actual address level data from CostQuest, which gives us a unique location ID that can be cross-referenced back to that public FCC state level by technology. So I can basically say, okay, this MDU has this unique ID, and I can look up that unique ID in the FCC data. And in that fabric data, there's one more field, which is the unit count. It's known to not be the most reliable field in the data. We know that a lot of our MDUs are just misclassified. From what I've seen anecdotally, usually it's an apartment building that has 10 or 20 units. It might be only listed as having one unit. So mapping out your fabric data and multiplying by the number of units when you have it can at least give you a better understanding of how many households are unserved rather than just that one structure. Did that make sense, Alex? Should we go deeper?
Oh yeah, no, it does. Deb made a comment, a real value, and I'll read it since it's especially for me with reading with an accent makes it very, very comfortable. A real value of this and all HT layers it provides is being able to make scarce decisions about what type of digital inclusion intervention is needed. And good point, absolutely good point, because now you can see that. I mean, if it's remote learning, if it's education, whatever the application is, maybe it's public safety and so on, needed, and where the best place for them. So
I totally agree. I'm so glad Deb was able to join today. She brings so much insight to our team, and she focuses largely on digital equity, digital inclusion, and research projects. And we did some work in North Carolina and Stanley County, and we've also done a nationwide analysis of the ACP data, the Affordable Connectivity Plan. And although that plan is sunsetting and we're hoping it'll get more funding, but it's not looking terribly good at this point, we're able to look at that data and get some insights from it. LISC produced some analysis that estimated how many households were eligible for ACP per zip code. And we produced some analysis with them as to how many had actually participated in the program. And anecdotally, we found that there was a relationship between high participation in ACP and the availability of public Wi-Fi. So where we saw these locations in Stanley County where they didn't have public Wi-Fi, the uptake in ACP was lower. And so we were able to make some very specific location-oriented suggestions in their digital equity and digital inclusion plan to put some public access in those areas, to have device programs and digital literacy programs to help take those people who have traditionally been non-adopters and give them the opportunity to join the digital economy in a way where they didn't have to just pay for everything right out front, because a lot of times cost is a barrier. And so these are the other types of data sets, such as the American Community Survey median income data. And one of the things I like to look at in that data, the demographic data, is the percentage of income spent on rent on average. And if that starts to get over 40 to 50%, you've got a real affordability issue. You can look at the poverty, you can look at telecommuters, you can look at how many of those homes are estimated to have an internet subscription or a computer in the household. So we'd always love to have more granular data, from the census. We usually have it at the census tract level, which, usually there's 3 or 4 tracts per county. It's not anywhere near as granular as what you see with these blocks. But there are privacy issues, so I don't expect we'll see much more granular data in the near future. But these are the types of things that we bring together that help inform decision making, whether it comes to writing grants for infrastructure or doing it for digital equity, digital inclusion, digital literacy, telemedicine purposes.
One more question from Steven. Steven,
Okay.
Hey, thanks for joining us. So on this slide, Brian, for Transylvania County, what are the light red colors representing partially unserved? Are these areas not funded? Can you just walk through the colors again, please?
Yes, absolutely. So the darker the color of red and orange, although there's really not much orange in here, you pretty much have it or you don't in Transylvania County. There's not much in between. So the areas that are dark red, the larger percentage of the locations in that census block do not have service. So the light colored census blocks, most of the locations have service, but there's some sprinkled throughout those census blocks that are unserved. And since the gray areas and black areas are kind of masking out what's been served by federal funding and by state funding, everything you see in red is unserved and unfunded. And so these represent areas where we can go after funding to do infrastructure deployments. And thank you for the questions. I appreciate the interactivity and more than happy to answer any additional questions that everybody has.
Well, let's keep walking. Otherwise, it's going to be more than an hour.
All right. We'll keep going. So broadband availability statistics and construction capital cost estimates. When we run a report out of BroadbandAnalyzer, we look at how many total households. We're looking at the census blocks. So in this particular case, there were 27,685 total households in the area. Of them, 606 are unserved with 25 down, 3 up, which represents 2% of the households. And the average cost estimate, and we start at a high level. We have some default settings as far as how much it costs for a linear mile of fiber, how much it costs per drop to go from the curb or the pole to the location of the premise itself. And then about how much wireless coverage that you can get. So we're trying to get high level pre-engineering, pre-feasibility estimates, often used for grant writing and to actually go after money to do the engineering. This can help you understand both the scale of your problem, the approximate cost per household. Is in this particular area, it's approximately $14,000 per household to hook them up with fiber. And cables not too far off of that number. And we have a wireless cost of about $1,800 per location. Now, this doesn't mean you could serve everybody in the area with wireless. If we identify an area that looks promising for wireless, that's when we start doing propagation analysis and said, okay, if we put this equipment at this height on this tower, we could serve, these households with these speeds, and doing that in a way that takes into account trees, buildings, earth, all the things that will block or at very least impede wireless signals from reaching folks. And we also
you do produce some kind of a preliminary propagation study to make the assumption of who's being covered and who's not.
Yeah, we don't have the functionality in BroadbandAnalyzer to actually run the propagation analysis itself. That's a pretty specialized function. But most providers that we work with will have access to one, whether it be Google's Network Planner or some of the other commercial tools that are out there, towercoverage.com being another one that folks have used. But those will all export data that we can import into BroadbandAnalyzer, and then we analyze from there. So
and use it as a layer.
Running the actual propagation, we can analyze it, put your addresses in, figure out which addresses would get which signal strength, at which point you can figure out what speeds they can get.
Awesome. Thank you.
And this second table that we have here is basically the same as the first table, except it's looking at the underserved, those who lack 100 by 20, and kind of give you both of those analysis. So if you need to contact us, info@broadbandcatalyst.com, brian@broadbandcatalyst.com. I'm going to go ahead and switch out of PowerPoint mode and show you some of the outputs from BroadbandAnalyzer so you can get an idea of what it looks like. So this is a GIS map that we created by exporting data that was processed in BroadbandAnalyzer, and we're now using it in QGIS, but they're geo packages or shape files or KML. So the data that gets output from BroadbandAnalyzer you can use in Google Earth, Esri, ArcGIS, QGIS, or pretty much any other GIS platform that's out there. It's fairly standardized spatial data. So the first thing I'm going to show is the unserved locations here for Harlan County, Kentucky. And again, we've broken these out by their linear households per mile. And you can see that the lighter colored have more than 15 households per linear road mile. There's 82 hexagons that meet that criteria. So these are the ones we would consider commercially viable. And we generally don't recommend spending your grant dollars on commercially viable areas unless it's going to help get to these higher cost areas. The high cost areas, it's really difficult to make a business case. So if you give up all of the density, if a fiber provider came in and said, hey, I'll handle these, and you leave those high cost out, you've actually made it more difficult to make the business case to get to these higher cost areas. And if you want to look at the highest cost areas, these are the hexagons where there's fewer than 3 households per linear road mile. And we highly recommend that communities prioritize these locations, because if we spend these dollars and we don't serve these locations, it's very unlikely that even a wireless provider can come in and just serve those locations, because there's just not enough households there to earn back the investment in a reasonable amount of time. We do the same thing for the underserved. There's not quite as many here in Harlan County. They also kind of have that, you either have it or you don't. And so you can see that we've even got some high cost underserved. We put these together. This is what we would recommend this county prioritize. And as you'll see in a moment, they actually did a pretty good job of it because they had already assigned some priority zones. But let me show you a little bit more of what we brought into this. We brought in all of the roads data, and we classified the roads by US highways, state recognized. The common name, other and unclassified, those are your more secondary roads. And what we did with this is a couple of things. One, we provide this just because it's useful for general purposes for planning, but we used it in evaluating how far all of their structures are from the road. Because while these hexagons represent high cost areas where there's low housing density, you can have really dense areas and have a household, a lot of times it's a farm, that sits 1,000 or 2,000 feet from the roadway. And by default, most providers will hook up locations that are within 250 feet of the road at no additional cost. They may have an install fee of $99 or a couple $100, but they're not going to charge you per foot to get to your location. In my case, I'm 750 feet from the road, and to get fiber built to my location was going to be somewhere between $7,500 and $10,000. I ended up doing it myself a little bit cheaper, but my neighbors really don't have that option. So we wanted to understand, where are these structures that are far off the road? So using that road data combined with some address data that we were able to source. So we've got all of the structures. I'm going to turn the roads off, make this easier to see. So all of these black dots are structures in their database. We ran the analysis on them to figure out which ones are nearest to the road. So all the ones that are in white are about 200, less than 250 feet from the road. That constitutes about 15,000 of those locations. But when you get to the ones that are between 250 to 500 feet, there's 482 locations that are in that. You're probably going to spend between 1,000 and 5,000. When you get beyond 500 feet, That's when you start looking at $5,000 to $10,000 installs, and there's 89 locations here. And if you get out beyond 1,000 feet, you're talking $20,000, $30,000 installs a lot of the time, and they've got 34 locations. So we want to make sure that even if the area that they're in is indicated as served, that they truly are served. Because a cable or a fiber provider might build down a road. They don't automatically build to every structure. And when they report to the FCC, if they can build to the structure within 10 business days reasonably, they'll list it as served. Now, if that farmer, for example, calls up to order service, they'll usually send an engineer out to look at it. And it's at that point that the homeowner or the farmer is notified, hey, you're too far off the road. That's going to be a $25,000 build, at which point the farmer just decides, quite often, hey, I can't afford that, or that doesn't make sense for me, so I'm not going to do it. And they end up being unserved in an area that's indicated as served. So this is a way to facilitate the availability challenge process for these high cost locations. And it's important to know that in the federal funds coming down, there are funds to hook these locations up. But you've got to identify them and prioritize them and work with the providers to make sure that we're doing our due diligence and hooking up the highest cost locations now while we have funding. Because if we miss it, it's very unlikely we're going to see another funding round of this scale soon. In this particular case, I'm using data I'm allowed to show you publicly. We actually did analysis of their fabric data, but that fabric data is private. It's confidential. So I've removed that from this map. But we did the same analysis of how far all of the fabric locations are from the road. So we can say these are the ones that are listed as unserved, underserved, have no service at all, that are far from the road. And we can put a different bucket of locations that are indicated as served, but are so far off the road, we find them highly questionable. And at that point, we can reach out to those areas, do surveys, do other work to make sure we don't miss high priority, high cost locations. Some additional data. Go ahead.
If I could ask, I wanted to see how many people on this call have networks, either fiber, wireless. If you guys don't mind kind of answering that question, I'm gonna launch the poll right now for maybe a minute just to have a quick one. I would appreciate.
Fantastic. And while folks are answering that question, I'll move through to some of the other layers that we have here. Opportunity zones are something that been a bit of a disappointment in the broadband world. It's been difficult to get impact investors to invest in broadband infrastructure in opportunity zones. There's only 2 years left on that legislation. There's a lot of impetus for these impact funds to get these dollars invested. And if you're going to build conduit structures like POPs or central offices, fiber routes, towers, these are the types of assets that have long-term value that impact investors might be interested in. So we want to make sure that people know where the opportunity zone is in their area, so that they're aware and don't miss opportunities in that regard. And when we look at our community anchor institution data, I'm going to turn these other layers off real quick just so that we're not cluttered. We have a number of buckets of community anchor institution data. I'm going to turn them on one at a time and we'll kind of go through them real quick. So first we have the towers. This is again from the FCC's antenna structure registration database. They tell us how many towers, how many masts, and then we have a bunch of them classified as unknown. So in Harlan County, there are 10 known towers, 1 mast, and 38 unknown. Those unknown might just be a piece of land that the tower owner owns. It might be a pole, might be a small attachment on the top of a building, but it's not a full-on tower. This is not a comprehensive data set. We usually like to augment this. Public safety towers, county-owned towers, water towers are generally not included in that public data set, but we can add additional data to this. Nonetheless, this is useful. We've got your government facilities, which includes your fire stations, of which there's 19 here, law enforcement, there's 8 of those and 1 prison. The fire stations in particular are of really high value when you're looking at deploying broadband infrastructure in rural areas, so we do tend to focus on them quite a bit. We've also got your educational facilities, college and universities, daycare centers, places of worship, private schools, and public schools. And these are a lot of the places where you might end up doing digital literacy, device programs. They can be great connectors into the community, so we always like to know where those are when we're trying to help folks. We've got our primary health care, which is hospitals, nursing homes, and pharmacies. And we've recently been adding the HSRA, primary care, mental health, and dental health facilities. And so, when we were discussing this, we talked about the fact that if you look at the extremities of the county, there's areas where it's a good distance to get to those facilities, and this southwestern quadrant might be a good candidate for some telemedicine facilities, just so that the folks there can get to it a little bit more easily and alleviate some of those transportation problems. Turn those off real quick. So we also bring in, as I said, the funding. In this case, there's an RDOF award. We do count the hexagons that have a substantial overlap with the RDOF awards, more than 25% overlap. But I'm going to show you the actual geometry of the RDOF award itself, and you can see some of these locations where Windstream was awarded this RDOF award. It's kind of small, doesn't represent an entire hexagon. So both of those views are important to understand where Windstream has committed to building based on their RDOF funding. And so we can't go into those areas and get additional federal funds because they've already been funded. Now, in this particular case, turn to CAIs, this particular county had done some work. They sent us a map with their priority zones. And so the first
what
thing
happens if the area is funded via alternative funding bucket, let's say from Treasury or from USDA?
Yeah, they won't. There's a deconfliction process that goes on between these different agencies. If you apply for a USDA Reconnect grant, for example, and part of the area you've applied for was funded by the Capital Projects Fund, or even the state funds that have flowed down through ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act, to the state, those agencies will coordinate with one another and come back and ask you to remove those prior funded locations from your application, because you cannot overbuild federal dollars with federal dollars. So if it was funded perhaps by a foundation, a nonprofit, not using federal dollars, you might be able to overbuild it. But if it was funded through USDA, Capital Projects Fund, ARPA, CARES, CAF2, BIP, all of these different funding programs, you're not going to be able to get funds to overbuild it. And that's been a bit of a frustration for programs like RDOF, which had I think it was a 6-year window after the award to build. And a lot of those haven't been built yet. And so folks looking at BEAD and looking at some of these ARPA programs or the USDA programs are interested in overbuilding them, but they're kind of restricted from doing so.
Thank you. I'm going to launch another poll out of curiosity to see how many attendees on this call are going after additional funding. So if you guys don't mind answering while Brian continues with the slides.
Excellent. Thank you, Alex. So what we did with their priority zones is we first identified how many hexagons with unserved locations intersected with those priority zones. So you can see we've lit up, and they did a really good job of kind of lining up with where these areas are. If I bring up the high cost, you can see they did a really good job of hitting the middle section. Not quite as good of a job of getting to those high cost areas. So we ended up recommending that they expand their zones or look very seriously at those high cost areas to see if they might want to expand upon those. But once we had these hexagons, we intersected that with their structures. And so we can find out which exact locations are in each of these zones. And then we looked at how far those are from the road. So we can identify within our priority zones where those high cost locations are. And there weren't a lot of them, but they are there. So this is, again, just a way of us saying, okay, if you serve in this zone, this is how many of these locations you're going to serve. With the fabric data, we're able to determine how many of them are underserved, unserved, or served, and start to build the business case based on the actual numbers. Then it really comes down, every conversation I have, we always want to understand where are the existing providers in this area. And so we do provider footprints. And what I'm going to do is turn off all of them real quick. I've put the fixed wireless in their own bucket. So we've got AT&T has fixed wireless access. They do residential and business, and they just have this one lonely little hexagon right here. So yeah, AT&T's in the county, but they don't really have very comprehensive coverage. But if I wanted fiber in this area, I could at least contact AT&T and see if they would sell us middle mile wholesale fiber. We've got Eastern Technology has these 4 hexagons over here where they do some fixed wireless. And I'm going to bring up the topographical map here in a minute, and you're going to see why fixed wireless is so challenging in this particular market. T-Mobile has the largest amount of fixed wireless availability in 56 hexagons. And then Verizon Wireless has some business-only fixed wireless that is in some pretty limited geographies. But nonetheless, if they're serving fixed wireless from here, they also likely have fiber from there that they're using to feed that fixed wireless deployment. And then we've got the cable providers. Access Cable serves this northeastern portion of the county. Charter Communications has a small footprint here in the west. The largest provider in the county you can see is Harlan Community Television, and that they've got 272 hexagons that they're in. I'm going to turn those off real quick. When I bring up the open fiber from Kentucky, I looked at this and I thought, this is really strange. We've only got 1 hexagon. And when we were talking to the rep from Harlan, he says, yeah, that's what feeds our public Wi-Fi. So we know why they're indicating only 1 location with their business fiber from Open Fiber Kentucky, and they're using that for their public Wi-Fi. But if there was a new entrant that wanted to come into this market, that's one of the middle mile providers we could go talk to. And then TDS Telecom has fiber and DSL, which is along this route that's been prioritized. If I go back and turn on my priority zones, you'll see zone 1 lines up pretty well with TDS's coverage area. The folks there have reported that they're not happy with that coverage. A lot of it's DSL. And let's face it, our copper networks are not aging very gracefully. But one of the things I pointed out was the terrain. Oh my goodness. Can you imagine building fixed wireless in this terrain? It's just mountains and mountains and valleys. So you could probably shoot fixed wireless down one of these valleys and get some decent coverage for the folks who aren't way back up in the trees. But this is a topographically challenging area, and having some different ways of looking at it, including, Google's hybrid map. We can kind of go in and look at these areas. And one of the things that I'd like to do, I've got this nice little plug-in for QGIS that lets me jump right over to Street View. So I can actually go look at their priority zone. What is it not going to work for me now? Make a liar out of me? Sometimes they're like that. Let me see if I can get it to work. I'm betting it's bringing up browser windows. Yeah, there they are. Okay, so basically it'll jump me over to a view where I can actually come and start to look at the infrastructure. which I find really useful because these horseshoe or tennis racket shaped devices here in general hold excess fiber capacity. And usually if it's a fiber deployment, you'll see some sort of, you can almost see it, there is an orange reflector where that fiber connects to the pole. And right above that, you can see these drop downs by the pole. Those are used in the coaxial. So this is cable, coaxial cable for the cable TV, cable internet provider. More than likely that fiber right below it is what's feeding the internet portion of their build. Sometimes you'll see the fiber lashed directly to the coax, which gives you a really good indication that it's owned by the cable company. But when I only see cable and a fiber line, I generally will assume that they're under the same ownership until I learn otherwise. But I find that very useful when we're going out and looking, one, at the condition of the poles, how much inventory is on the poles. Is it likely that they either need to do pole replacement, which there are funds for that, or that they need to do make-ready work where they need to either move things around or prepare the poles in some other way so that a new provider can attach their infrastructure. So those are the major things that I wanted to cover today. I see we've got about 4 minutes left. Love to see if anybody has any additional questions, and happy to dive a little deeper before we run out of time.
Oh, that is impressive. I don't know. Now I got more questions than I had at the beginning. Yeah, because what I saw is with some of the projects is make ready costs for aerial fiber sometimes just threw the whole body off.
Yeah,
completely, depending on the I mean, some utilities you're just coming in and that's it. Like, got to replace the poles.
Yeah, when we did this analysis of Harlan County, we spot checked each of their zones and evaluated the pole condition in the zones. And zone 1 had the weakest pole infrastructure. The poles are shorter, they're smaller. Some of them show some condition issues. They're running along a river valley. Some of them were kind of leaning out over the river. And I thought, boy, I wouldn't want to have to be the lineman who had to go fix that pole. So when we looked at zone 3, their poles were much newer, taller. So we were able to at least get a sense of what the pole replacement requirements, and then from that, what those costs will be. We fed that back into BroadbandAnalyzer to increase the cost per mile based on our anticipated pole replacement and make-ready requirements.
Let me ask you a question. So let's say you have a prospect that may be interested, potential applying for a grant, and they need just and they're looking for preliminary work from you. Just an idea. How long may it take from you to just run the basic analysis, come back with areas and strategic locations, maybe where the tower has to go, or how much the fiber would cost, how many?
Less than a week. We can get initial numbers within 5 minutes, but actually doing the spot checking the pole costs, checking for additional factors, we take a few days and do some research. So it's as quick as 5 minutes, pull up a location in BroadbandAnalyzer. And one of the things I didn't do that I want to show real quick with BroadbandAnalyzer is the fact that the rules vary depending on where you're building infrastructure. And so to give you an example, we just did an analysis in North Carolina where the provider was looking at 2 different grant programs, USDA Reconnect and the North Carolina Completing Access to Broadband. And I have pulled up the wrong URL, so give me a second. It helps if you put in the right IP address if you want to bring up your application. So when we're going in and we pull up a location, so I'm just going to give you a quick example because I know we're running up on time. But if I were to go to North Carolina and bring up Rutherford County, I can look at my availability layers. I can pick I'm just going to pick 25/3 and 100/20. And in my map options, I have the ability to select which technology. So if I'm evaluating for North Carolina's CAB program, I'll select the hexagons, I'll include the businesses, but North Carolina has said DSL and copper service does not count as broadband. That's the same with satellite and pretty much all fixed wireless, and including electric over power line. So if I were looking at USDA Reconnect, I would leave all these copper and at the very least the licensed fixed wireless checked, because they count those as served, whereas North Carolina's rules are different. So once I apply my geographic area, and then I can bring this up, it'll give you an idea of how quickly we can analyze an area at the basic level, get those initial cost estimates. So now we're bringing up Rutherford County.
And when you say licensed, is CBRS part of it or not?
So CBRS is tricky. So CBRS, there is a completely generally available spectrum. It's called GAA. You don't have to pay any money to use it. And that is considered licensed by rule. And then if you bought a priority access license, which is county by county, and there was an auction a couple of years ago where providers purchased these priority access licenses, is if you're using a priority access license, it's considered technology code 71, which you see right here, which is fixed wireless licensed. If you are not using a PAL, CBRS is considered fixed wireless licensed by rule. And if you're using a combination of PAL and GAA, it's still considered licensed.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's all the time it took for me to pull up Rutherford County. I've got my cost estimates. It takes about 5 minutes to export one of those reports. And you can see over here, this is where we can put in our different costs for our different cost groups of how much it costs per linear mile, how much each drop is estimated to cost. We have those abilities to go in and filter it out. And then once we get all that done, we can download the report, which is geared toward, you know, folks who are not immersed in broadband, grant writers, county managers, folks at the Council of Governments, those types of things. These reports are very appropriate for those audiences. And I'll just take 30 seconds real quick and show you what one of those looks like. If I can get back to my desktop. This is one I did for Ashley, Arkansas. This is what the report looks like. This was done for a project we're working on with LISC called their Broadband Help Hub Technical Assistance. And it kind of gets you down to where we're just giving you the high points. We're not giving you all the detail. And then each of the maps that we have in here, it's an embedded interactive map. So you can zoom in, you can turn on different layers, you can turn on community anchor institutions, you can use different base layers. So this is something that every community can put on their website. It's all public data in this. This is kind of the counterpoint to the GIS maps that we produce. This is kind of static. It's not really easy to add additional data to, but you can share it publicly on a website very easily, or you can just email this file and folks can open up in a browser. And then if you want to do more of that detailed long-term type of research, we recommend using the GIS map. So I see that we're over time, and I just want to say thank you to everybody that came today, and thank you to Alex and LightLinks for hosting this webinar. It's been a real pleasure.
Brian, thank you as always. I appreciate it. Well, guys, thank you for joining us. And obviously, this session has been recorded. We will send out links, or it's going to be uploaded to YouTube at some point. So you could have an offline kind of session. And any questions, feel free to send them to Brian, to us. And I look forward, continue the conversation and provide the services to make this world faster. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you to everybody who attended. I hope you have a great day.
All right, take care.